All right, if everybody could come back, find your seats. I just want to give a couple kind of schedule things. Somebody asked me earlier, so I just want to make sure everybody knows the plan for tomorrow. During the morning, we have two worship services, 8:15 and 11 o'clock. And Hans, I'm so sorry. This is so awkward to not be able to say your name correctly, and it's my apologies. Madawami. That's it. I had to go through my phonetics. Madawami. He's going to be preaching for us in both services. And Joey Kime is going to be doing the Sunday school lesson. All of that will be in here. So Sunday school will be a combined classroom in the sanctuary. So let me go ahead and pray. Then we're going to turn it over to Joey for the second session. Father, I thank you for today. I thank you already for the conversations that have been prompted by our meeting together. And I just pray that you continue to help our minds to see the importance of processing through our use of technology. Give us wisdom as we just think through what directions we need to do as individuals, as families. If any of us lack wisdom, we need to ask you for that. That's what your word says. And we do lack wisdom in a lot of ways in this topic. Things have come at us so quickly, and we aren't always ready. So we just ask that you would give us wisdom and encourage us as we listen now. It's in Jesus' name I pray. Amen.
Almost on? There we go. Good afternoon. You've already gotten to hear from me a little bit. I probably introduced myself more than I meant to, but felt more appropriate in that context. Tonight, or this afternoon, I should say, I want us to talk about what our kids actually need, particularly in this digital age. But before I jump in there, I started to say I work with RYM as a trained counselor. So that's where I went to Covenant Theological Seminary in St. Louis. My wife and I moved there in 2019. We weren't married yet. We knew each other before seminary, and then, we got married during seminary. We have two little girls at home, both 1 year old, which means they are twins. So she's home right now, but I'm very happy to be here and in Hickson with y'all. Do y'all say Hickson or Chattanooga? Do y'all say Hickson? So if you're introducing yourself, you don't say I live in Chattanooga. Okay, good to know. Alongside my work as a trained counselor, so I work for a private practice there, and my wife is also a counselor. She works for our church's counseling center. I get to work with RYM. That means I'm not a trained pastor, so I'm not going to try to preach at y'all. I'm going to try to teach y'all some things. In my role with RYM, the thing I love the most is that we get to come alongside churches and help them think about how to raise up youth well, particularly in the faith, whether that's the conferences we do, which Hickson comes to, and at our youth leader events and the resources we produce. Our goal is to make this job feel less chaotic, make this job feel more possible, more hopeful, because it's a really beautiful calling to get to serve young people. But I want to start tonight by just addressing how overwhelming this all feels. Technology is not new, but we are in kind of an interesting place with technology in 2026. And we've been here for a little bit. We've heard questions about AI. We've heard questions about social media. We hear even questions about the devices themselves. And this is a pretty strange climate. So if you're feeling overwhelmed when it comes to technology for yourself or for your kids or your grandkids, I just want to start off by saying that doesn't mean you're failing. But it does mean that you're living, parenting, and grandparenting in a really, really strange cultural change. Cultural change that happened really fast. And when that happens, it always destabilizes the family. Think about it this way. For most of human history, parents and children inhabited the same world. They might disagree, but they had roughly the same access to information, culture, and experience. That is no longer true. Our children and our teens today carry in their pockets a device that can access effectively the sum of humanity, all that humans know, the worst parts of human behavior, unfiltered adult content, anonymous peers, comparison that is amplified by algorithms, and now increasingly artificial intelligence as well. That's not normal, and that was not normal for most of the arc of humanity. So if you feel like you're playing catch up, you are. And again, that's not a moral failure. That doesn't mean you're doing something wrong. It's our reality. And so my goal this afternoon is not to scare you. It's not to hand you a laminated rule sheet, and it's certainly not to make you feel like you're behind. My goal is to help you, your neighbors, and anybody else who you might talk about this with understand that we're dealing with developmentally, psychologically, and relationally complicated issues. Those things are exacerbated by technology, not necessarily invented by them, but they're happening to our kids at an unprecedented rate at a time in their life when their brains aren't even really prepared how to handle it. So hopefully, coming out of this lesson and our Q&A with Hans as well, my goal is that you'll be able to respond with more clarity and less panic, even as we talk about really complicated things. Because rarely does panic produce wisdom. In most cases, it produces reaction. And that's actually what a lot of the media companies are hoping for. They want us just to keep reacting instead of trying to think about how to use it proactively. So more than anything else, the teens, and I realize there's some youth in here tonight, and I'm really glad you're here. But what teens need most is not reaction, but they need steady adults. Whether that's adults in their family or in their church or in their schools, whether it's their parents or their aunts and uncles or their grandparents, they need those people to be steady. So I want to start off next with just talking about the mental health shift that Hans brought up. Again, this was some research that came out in Jonathan Haidt's book. And he kind of proposes that around 2010 to 2012, something pretty dramatically shifted. He goes on to say that the reason they even noticed that it was around 2015 when the college students coming in just started to sound different, and they were trying to figure out why that was. Rates of anxiety and depression among adolescents took a really sharp turn. Emergency room visits for self-harm increased. Clinicians across the country started reporting something very similar. Kids were more anxious, more avoidant, more emotionally fragile, and less able to tolerate normal stress. And here's why this is important. This wasn't a sudden collapse in parenting quality. It wasn't a dramatic overhaul in school systems, and it wasn't the invention of video games or television. What changed was a widespread adoption of smartphones and social media. By 2012, smartphones had become common. Instagram had launched, Snapchat was growing, portable, private, internet-connected devices were now in the hands of middle schoolers. And the mental health curves that they began tracking began to bend upright around that time. So I will say, as a counselor, as somebody who has a little training in terms of reading research studies and behavioral science, correlation is not causation. Mental health is a lot more complex than that. Family systems matter, trauma matters, genetics matter, temperature matters, all of it matters. But when national and global data, international comparisons, clinical expertise, and parent reports all start saying the same thing, it's worth us paying attention. Again, that doesn't mean that every anxious teen has a phone problem, but it does mean that their environments matter, and those in those environments matter a whole lot too. Technology didn't invent anxiety, but it did change the environment in which anxiety develops, and so we'll get to development a little bit more. But those environments matter a lot because they actually shape our nervous systems. Proverbs speaks of paths, repeated ways of living that eventually shape who we become. That's not modern psychology. That's actually biblical wisdom. What we become what we repeatedly practice. So if a child repeatedly practices comparison, image management, private scrolling, instant distraction, and conflict avoidance, those repetitions become those paths, and they do shape something. It doesn't mean doom, but it does mean formation. When I sit with teenagers today, I'm not just hearing things like, I'm sad. I'm hearing, I'm bored all the time. I can't stop thinking about how I'm perceived. I don't feel good enough. I can't sit still. I feel anxious when I have my phone and when I don't have my phone. I don't know who I am without this device. And it's actually not because kids today are weaker than they were 10 years ago or 100 years ago. It's because they're developing in a very different ecosystem. It's kind of like the reality where if we plant the same seed in different soil, you do get different growth patterns, right? I'm from Florida originally, and there's all sorts of plants in Missouri that are not native there. But if I took some plants that were really common in Florida and I tried to put them in Missouri where we have snow, most of them are going to have a much harder time growing. So we do need to pay attention to the soil that we're planting these seeds. But before we go any further into kind of just the dangerous soil, before we talk about rules, before we even talk about the smartphone apps, which I'll name a few that I think are great examples of where the media companies are doing exactly what they want to do in an unhealthy way, we need to talk about development a little bit. And so starting off, there's a lot of thought, there's a lot of research, there's been different developmental theorists over the decades. I'm not going to pin this on any specific one. I want to just talk a little bit more broadly because we had a great question around like how phones and tablets even affect us and how do we combat it. And what those devices, what screens are doing, is in some way relevant to which stage that person's in. So the way that it impacts a 6-year-old is going to be different than how it impacts a 16-year-old. So I want to talk a little bit about these developmental stages next. So during our kind of earliest stage, right, so for younger children, particularly probably after 2 years old up till about 6 or 7, we're going to talk about the younger children. So what young kids need. When children are young, their primary developmental task is not independence. Despite how much that 2-year-old says no, what they really need is safety. Not just physical safety, but emotional safety too. Young children do not regulate their emotions alone. We know that they borrow regulation from the adults. That's not just metaphorical, it's actually neurological. It's what happens in their brain when an adult kind of attends to a little one. They can't calm themselves down first and then come to you. They calm because you are calm. They settle because your voice slows, because your breathing steadies, and because your presence signals safety. This is what we are talking about when I'm talking about co-regulation, and it's the foundation for emotional resilience, the opposite of what Jonathan Haidt is talking about with the anxious generation. Now here's where the technology quietly intersects. If a child is upset and the primary strategies they see their parents using and are conditioned to use themselves, when we hand them a phone or when we turn on a show or we distract them really quickly, that child may quiet down, but they are not actually learning how to regulate. They are learning to escape. The screen can suppress noise, but it cannot build the resilience that they get in relationship with adults. That doesn't mean that all screens are evil, as we've already talked about, but it does mean that screens cannot do what relationships does. So one of the most important questions parents of young children can ask is this: when my child is distressed, do I instinctively move towards presence or towards distraction? When my child is distressed, do I instinctively move toward presence or toward distraction? And I want to say this gently. If you move towards distraction sometimes, that doesn't make you a bad parent, right? We've all been in the 8-hour car ride where the kid's screaming and we just kind of want them to calm down for a few minutes. We all do it. We all get tired. Sometimes we need a break. Like I said, I have 2 1-year-old twins at home. I get it. But if distraction becomes the dominant regulatory strategy, something subtle begins to shift that becomes pretty significant. that child eventually learns that discomfort must be avoided, boredom must be filled, and that big feelings must be escaped. Instead of discomfort is survivable. Feelings rise and then they fall. And that connection makes things manageable. Stage 2 is what I would call middle childhood. As children move into middle childhood, their developmental needs shift. They begin to care deeply about their competence in the world. They want to feel capable, they want to feel skilled, and they want to feel effective in their world. At this stage, modern technology minimizes friction. Friction is not a flaw in development, it is actually a fuel for growth. Think about things like learning an instrument. Learning an instrument requires friction. It actually requires that attempt, and we didn't get it quite right, and so we have to try again. Building friendships requires friction. Practicing a sport requires friction. Reading a difficult book sometimes even requires friction. But most digital environments are engineered to remove friction. Games are optimized to reward quickly. Videos autoplay. Algorithms serve what holds attention, and then another one, and then another one. There's always something new, there's always something easier. So what happens? Our little brains adapt. When stimulation is constant and effortless, effort itself begins to feel intolerable. That friction that we need to actually learn and grow starts to be the thing that we can't handle. And this is something I see it in my friends' kids, I see it in my nephews and nieces. I'm not quite seeing it in my own kids yet, but I definitely hear it in my counseling room a lot. Kids saying things like, "It's just too boring. I don't feel like it. It just frustrates me. I can't really focus," right? These are all sentiments coming from a world that has primarily existed without any friction at all. It's not necessarily laziness, but it is kind of proof that the nervous system in that child has adapted to rapid reward cycles. I could say plenty more on dopamine, but when dopamine, which is it's a neurotransmitter in our brain that tells us things feel good. When dopamine spikes are frequent and easy, slow mastery feels underwhelming. The feel good that we used to get from eating lunch, or the feel good that we would get from figuring out how to play a song on the piano, that's going to pale in comparison to how fast we can get it and how intensely we can get it from a video on TikTok. But some encouragement to parents. This is why boredom is not an emergency. In fact, boredom is often the doorway that gives birth to things like problem solving, imagination, and perseverance. But if a device immediately fills every moment of boredom, which, as adults, if we're being honest, does for us, how often do you pull out your phone the moment you sit down at the doctor's office? Or when you get on an elevator? Or even when you're sitting there at a red light? When we pull out our devices to kind of thwart that even momentary feeling of boredom, the doorway closes. And if children never learn practicing and tolerating frustration, they never will actually cultivate and build that frustration tolerance. So parents might ask, grandparents might ask, are there protected spaces in my child's life where boredom is allowed to exist long enough to turn into creativity, long enough to turn into that moment which actually cultivates resilience? Are there places in their world where effort is required and not intentionally optimized? Can we let them play the piano for 30 minutes and not get the song right so that tomorrow they might get closer? Those spaces are developmental gold. And lastly, and this is one I think that as we talk about social media apps is going to come up a lot. As children move into adolescence, so about 13 through 18, adolescence is a little bit different because teenagers are not just big kids. They are actually in some intersection between childhood and adulthood, and they are in the process of constructing our identity. They are asking big questions like, who am I? Where do I belong? What do I believe? Am I wanted? Am I enough? These questions aren't optional. All the researchers would say these are developmental tasks that they have to be completed. And I would encourage you to just even reflect on how God intended that to be so in the context of relationship with Him and with the family. Adolescents need belonging that is embodied, identity that forms slowly as God meant it to, not because they watched 15 videos on Instagram. Risk that is contained within attachment. Now, I want us to think about how the technology intersects here, because social media offers a very different type of identity formation. Social media offers instant visibility, instant feedback, validation signals, and markers or belongings. Things like likes on a post, comments, followers, views. But visibility isn't belonging. Belonging requires being truly and fully known, being tolerated, being forgiven, being chosen repeatedly, being loved without performance. But visibility, right, what we need to actually fit in the world of social media, does require performance. And that performance can become really, really exhausting. So one of the most common themes I hear from teenagers, particularly in the counseling room, is they'll say something similar to, I feel like I have to manage how people see me all the time. From what I post to what I wear to how I sound to what I talk about, right? All of this is under the microscope of what other people might be thinking and seeing. And that's proof that the development is meeting the algorithm in the most unhealthy of ways. Because the adolescent brains are wired for peer sensitivity to people their age and to people older than them. That's normal and that's very healthy. But when peer visibility becomes constant, identity formation becomes really, really fragile. So when peer visibility becomes constant, identity formation becomes fragile. Instead of getting to ask questions like, who am I becoming? Teens ask, how am I being received? Instead of developing stable internal identities, they develop and adapt to external presentation. Now, this doesn't mean that every teen in this church or out there is doomed, but it does mean that they need adults who stay close enough to help them interpret that experience. Because there's a lot of negative things that happen online too, right? It's not just a platform of likes and comments. Sometimes those comments are really mean. Sometimes comments bring up things like exclusion or humiliation, or young kids are sexually compared. Sometimes they see some adult content that they didn't seek out in the first place. They have to sit with this horrible feeling of not sending a text and no one responds, or being left out of a group chat. They have to say they're okay, to keep the face up, but they're needing adults in the room who helps those experiences slow down. Asking questions like, what did that feel like? What story are you telling yourself? Is that story true? What do you need right now? Questions like this from adults helps that identity form slowly as it's supposed to, and it's formed in conversation and through relationships, not in the isolation, which is what the app is designed to do. And if identity formation happens primarily online and privately, for that matter, confusion tends to multiply. But if it happens in relationships, as I argued is how God designed it to, that's when we start to see resiliency grow. I'm going to shift us over to some of the risks. Again, I want us to get to talk about plenty of this in the next Q&A portion. But I want to take a moment to just even speak on why good parents find themselves blindsided over and over and over. And this may not be a brand new experience. Some of you in this room have kids who are adults already. And you probably were blindsided at points. Things they participated in, things they saw, things they found. One of the most common sentences I've heard in my counseling room from even the most engaged, wonderful parents sounds like something like this: I had no idea that was even possible. I had a parent just last week tell me that their child downloaded a book on Kindle, like on an old school Kindle device that was actually just laced with porn images. Like there was no words, it was just pictures, and their 11-year-old got it. And they're looking at me going, I didn't even know that was possible. And I want to say something very clearly. That reaction, that feeling of like, I had no idea. That doesn't mean that parents are being careless. It doesn't even mean that you're being too naive or that you were lazy. But it does mean that the digital kind of technology environment changed way faster than your parental intuition. Most of us, at least the adults in this room, grew up in a world where exposure to adult content required some amount of effort. Whether that was going to look for it, sneaking around, you probably had to risk being seen getting it. And you may have even had to like go find a physical location where you might be able to purchase it or see something. But the access to it was incredibly limited. Your privacy to get it was limited. And the distribution was limited. But today, that's a very different story, right? Access to it is immediate. It can be found on little portable mini computers that we keep in our pockets. And the distribution of it is totally instant. Once again, that little smartphone is not just a phone. It is a better way to probably think about a phone. The call app is one little feature on most smartphones. When in reality, it holds an internet browser, it's a private messaging system, it's a camera, it's a gaming console, it's a video broadcasting platform, it's a content recommendation engine, and now it's an AI companion. And all of that fits in our pockets on a little black screen that can disappear when we lock it. So when parents say, I didn't know, that's not even really ignorance. That's just the reality of the technological acceleration of what we're seeing right now. I've already mentioned some adult content things, and I just feel like this one is a big one because we're seeing trends of earliest exposure getting younger and younger and younger. I think for most boys, it's under 8 years old presently, and for most girls, it's still under like 12. There is some real risks. It's happening through things like group chats when someone sends a link and the kid doesn't know what it is and they just click on it and there it is. It's suggested videos on mainstream platforms. It's pop-up ads. It's gaming chat spaces. Maybe it's autofill on a search browser. Or it's curiosity that probably began pretty innocently that escalates rather quickly. And here's why this matters to us developmentally. Children, especially young kids, don't have mature frameworks for intimacy. They don't yet have stable senses of identity, and the emotional regulation to process arousal isn't there either. And in those spaces, especially when they're viewing it all alone, they don't have relational safety to even ask clarifying questions. There's all this stuff on a screen that doesn't make sense, and they have to kind of sit with it all by themselves. So what forms isn't more curiosity, it is confusion. But when confusion meets secrecy, that's when shame and guilt grow and they take hold. From a neurological perspective, sexual imagery strongly activates what we call like our reward circuitry. But when that activation happens in isolation, which again is not how God designed it to be, without relationship, the brain begins to wire three things together. And so arousal, secrecy, and novelty come together and form a really, really powerful driver. This is why early exposure quickly moves from curiosity to repetition. So let me slow down and say a few things that I want you to hear because I do think it's really, really important. Exposure, because there might be some of you in this room, whether it's a grandkid or one of your own children, who are thinking, I don't know what to do, it's too late. That moment already happened. Maybe that happened at a far too young age. Exposure does not automatically equal addiction. Curiosity does not automatically equal corruption. But when that child kind of has that element of secrecy layered on, it fuels a repetition that's far more powerful than desire. If a child is exposed and feels terrified of being found out, afraid of disappointing the parents, or unsure how to talk about it, that's when things like secrecy often become more powerful than the content itself. And then we start actually looking at the patterns of addiction. This is why calm early conversation matters. Not because we're trying to moralize early exposure by any means, but because we as the adults, we do want to help them interpret what they saw. Because when a child encounters something like that online, they need someone to help them process it. Again, their brain doesn't know what to do with it, and they'll go back with a little bit more curiosity, and that's actually what kind of fuels the repetition. Otherwise, right, so if the adults aren't there to help process it, the internet itself becomes that teacher. Another risk, again, I'm going to pick on a few apps. The second major risk that I'm seeing in the platforms is the design itself. Someone brought up the documentary, The Social Dilemma. The danger in most applications on the phones today isn't just the content, but it's actually the architecture itself. So many platforms, at least in 2026, are engineered around 3 design features. 1 is private communication. 2 is that amplification that happens through the algorithm. And 3, and they're not asleep to the fact that this is impacting kids, is the reduced accountability. So again, I promised to pick on a few. The students in this room might really hate me for this, but these are kind of the case in point. Apps that reflect these kind of 3 goals: the private communication, algorithmic amplification, and reduced accountability. Snapchat, it's been around since I was in college, or maybe even high school, so it's not new. It is one of the most used apps for adolescents and young adults. Its defining feature, what made it totally novel when it first released, was disappearing messages. You can send a message and receive a message that when you go back into that conversation, the text is gone. That might sound harmless. It might even sound a little bit playful. But what the research is showing us is that disappearing content actually changes behavior. When communication disappears, accountability decreases. And when accountability decreases, risk-taking increases. So I'll say that again. When communication disappears, accountability decreases. And when that accountability decreases, risk-taking increases. That's why apps like Snapchat are frequently associated with things like sexting, impulsive image sharing, pressure to reciprocate explicit photos, and an intense shame cycle that might occur when someone might take a screenshot of said content. So while the teen was initially thinking it's gone, doesn't really matter, relationally and neurologically it does matter. And that emotional imprint remains, even once the message or the picture disappears. Next up on my short list is TikTok. It's not just an entertainment app. I think most would argue it's probably the most complex, powerful, and influential algorithmic shaping machine in our culture today. The algorithm quickly learns, based on how long you even watch said video, what holds your attention, what might trigger your emotions, and what increases viewing time. So if you keep scrolling past videos, they know you don't want that, and the next time you pause and watch one a little bit longer, well, it knows to show you another one more similar. And it continues to evolve until basically your feed is exactly what you want to see. That's really powerful as adults. I mentioned TikTok is actually one of the most popular apps for that 55 and up category. For adolescents who don't have a fully formed brain yet, and who are especially wired for peer sensitivity, this amplifies things like sexual comparison, body image pressure, self-harm content exposure, extreme ideological content, and it fuels that performance-based identity. So, not picking on any parents necessarily in this room, but when I hear parents say it's just funny videos or everyone has one, all the teens are using it, that might be true, but over time it does form perception. And our perceptions of the world do shape who we are and what our identities are clinging to. In reality, the danger is probably not in one or two videos, but it is in 10,000 micro exposures over time. It is dangerous when it comes from a bottomless feed. If you guys ever notice, right, when you're scrolling, there's no end. You could be on Instagram the entire day. There will always be a little bit more to see. And that bottomless feed of content shapes who we are. Okay, and last but not least, again, there might be good uses of Snapchat. There might be some decent uses of TikTok. This one I'm going to pick on just for a second because it is a little bit probably more of a boy's favorite app. Discord is one, it's mostly tied with video gaming, but I'm mentioning it because of what the app can do. Discord is commonly used when people are playing video games across different consoles. So if you have a buddy who's playing PlayStation and there's a buddy playing Xbox, or if someone's on PC, those things don't talk to each other. So you use this third-party app called Discord, and so you can all have a good conversation. Seems pretty innocent and harmless. Discord is also notoriously home to a lot of anonymous servers, private messaging, adult-only communities that are not actually screening whether kids log in and check too. And, right, like with a lot of apps, there's minimal parental oversight even possible. When I hear this come up in my counseling room or as I'm working with youth pastors trying to figure out what to do about it, the most common things I hear Discord related to are exposure to explicit material, identity exploration in isolation. So maybe they do get on some sort of server that's talking about something really extreme, right? And they're just kind of forced to absorb all of that in isolation. It's also been linked to manipulation by older users, maybe soliciting content, and grooming behavior. So the risk isn't necessarily the gaming itself, the video games and the good times with a bunch of buddies playing together. It is the unmoderated adult access to a primary audience of underage users. I want to say something next that actually might feel a little bit uncomfortable. This is kind of one of those unique moments where, as a non-member of your church, hardly knowing any of you, I don't know where most of the families might fall on this spectrum. Shockingly, a lot of the counseling clients I get to work with, whether they're coming from Christian homes or non-Christian homes, one thread, and maybe this is just God's humor to give these people to me, one thread that comes up is I would categorize most of the families as pretty strict households. At least in my experience, a lot of the parents who care about bringing their kids to counseling is because they already have some rules in place. And if I'm getting parents bringing their teenagers from strict households, that means something about the strict household isn't doing enough. So this is where it might feel a little bit uncomfortable. Some of the most intense secrecy I see shows up in those homes that are highly structured, value-driven, maybe deeply concerned about holiness, and they're strongly rule-oriented. Why? Because when curiosity feels dangerous, secrecy feels safer. When mistakes feel catastrophic, hiding feels protective. If a child lets themselves believe, or maybe has a reinforced belief that if my parents find out, I'll lose connection with them, they will work very hard to prevent that discovery. So even if they've seen something that's really confusing or really disturbing, if they think they're going to get in trouble for it, they're not going to tell you. Which is really sad, right? Because they need the adults to help them interpret what they've just been exposed to. As much as we want to maybe consider that rebellion, often what's behind that rebellious behavior, or what's perceived as rebellious behavior, is fear. So I would caution to be extremely careful that the control alone is not going to protect your kids. We need literacy, we need presence, we need calm boundaries, and those students need relational safety because they are already really scared. Interestingly, by the time, this is maybe the misnomer about counseling, whether it's traumatic instances or issues, right? The counselor is often the last person to get involved. We might be the ones that have a few helpful tools, right? But if something really catastrophic happens at a school, the students, the teachers, the principal, the parents, all of them have to have engaged with it before anyone's going to get a counselor. So while we might sometimes feel like we have some good tools to give everyone, we're usually the last ones to help. By the time that technology issues show up in my counseling office, it's rarely just about screen time. When I'm talking with these teenage boys especially, it's the shame that they're carrying all alone. It's compulsive regulation through scrolling. It's exposure without interpretation. It's identity confusion that's amplified by comparison. And it's isolation disguised as connection. Technology becomes a way to cope with it, even if technology is where the problem started. Because technology promises to help numb, to distract, to regulate, and to escape. And if it's the only coping mechanism that that student has, right, because they don't feel like it's safe to bring up mom and dad, or they can't talk to grandma and grandpa, or they can't talk with their youth leader, then it becomes really sticky. And so they're coping with something that is actually trapping them more and more and more. This is why the solution is not just less phone. The solution is going to look like more literacy, more conversation, more presence, more embodied belonging, because that's what ultimately decreases. That's what's going to decrease that feeling of being stuck in the technology itself. And that risk-taking behavior that we talked about earlier that gets amplified, that dramatically decreases when children don't feel all alone. So far we've kind of named the landscape, right? Development matters. Exposure's happening a lot earlier than we even really want to let ourselves think about. I've talked a little bit about how platforms are designed to amplify vulnerability. And I've mentioned that strictness alone doesn't eliminate risk. So I think our question becomes, how do we build homes? How do we raise youth that are, while reducing exposure without increasing that secrecy, where it really sticks? And that's where I want to say presence and limits come together. So that's what we're going to turn to next. How we build homes that reduce risk without increasing secrecy. Right, so we've named the reality, we've talked about the development, we've talked about exposure, so what actually helps? Because if fear doesn't, and naivety doesn't, and control alone doesn't, what does? From a clinical standpoint, the answer is simple, but actually a lot more demanding on parents and adults than we want to admit. What helps is presence and limits held together consistently over time. Did I get that right? So let's start with presence. What I'm meaning, I don't mean hovering. I don't mean staring down their shoulder. I don't mean looking at every single text message they send. I'm not trying to suggest constant 24/7 hour surveillance. I don't mean emotional intensity, and I don't mean oversharing. Presence, as I was talking about it, is relational availability. It means that your child could experience you as someone they can move toward, not someone they must manage or run away from. Teenagers, so especially after they hit about 13 and are in that final stage of adolescent development, are constantly scanning for this question. If you really knew what was going on inside of me, would you still stay? So if teenagers are asking, if you really knew what was going on inside of me, or if you've seen what I've seen, would you still stay? Presence, so that relational availability, answers that question before crisis. One of the most common mistakes parents make is waiting until something goes wrong to start talking about technology. If every digital conversation begins with this discipline, kids associate conversation with consequence. So if we wait to talk about technology and all the ways that it's bad after the bad things happened, they're inevitably just going to think, let's not talk about technology with mom and dad. Presence means conversation before the crisis. It might even sound like, what do you like about that app? Because believe me, your kids are probably going to learn about them faster than you do. They're going to ask if they can have it before you understand what it means. They might have already downloaded it and created an account before you ever asked. So you get curious with them. What do you like about that app? What's annoying about it? Have you ever seen something online that made you feel uncomfortable? What do your friends think about that? Notice the tone. I'm suggesting curiosity, not interrogation. When parents only show up emotionally when something is wrong, kids learn that attention equals trouble. But when parents show up regularly with curiosity, kids learn that conversation is normal. And normal conversation makes honesty a lot easier later. So let's talk about one of the most important moments, maybe one of the scariest moments that happens as a parent. When your child tells you something you didn't want to hear. Maybe they admit that they saw something sexual online. Maybe they confess to sending a photo they shouldn't have. Maybe they tell you they've been hiding an account on an app that they're not supposed to have. Maybe you discover that thing and confront them. In that moment, right, we're not immune to this just because we become adults, our nervous systems spike. We may be feeling anger, we may be scared, we might be feeling betrayal and disappointment, or even embarrassment because we thought we were doing a pretty good job. And that's normal, and it makes a ton of sense. But here's the most important practical move you can make. Thank them. I've already kind of talked about how the student themselves is probably pretty scared to even have that conversation. I think one of the most helpful things that parents can do next is thank them for telling them. Before you correct, before you discipline, before you lecture, saying things like, thanks for telling me. That took courage. That took courage. I'm glad we're not in this alone. That one move shifts the emotional equation because it communicates that honesty will lead to connection, not exile. And if honesty feels safer than secrecy, that risk decreases long term. This doesn't mean that we eliminate consequences, but we prioritize stabilizing the relationship before we implement the consequence. And that order matters a lot. Presence after conflict, right? So presence, that emotional availability also means staying engaged after the discipline. A kid's worst fear is realized when the parent disciplines and then they emotionally withdraw. Because kids in their brain will interpret that as when I mess up, closeness disappears. But developmentally, growth happens when correction and connection coexist. So parents can still say things like, this is serious, and I love you. We need to address this, and I'm not going anywhere. And that dual message reinforces to them that mom or dad or grandma or grandpa or a youth pastor is still there no matter what comes out of their mouth next. There was a really great question around limits, and so I want to hit on this. Sorry, I've been kind of thinking about my talk as we've been going, thinking about some of the questions y'all already submitted, some of the things we've already talked about. But I want to spend a little time on limits, because limits are deeply misunderstood right now, especially in communities that value trust and responsibility like the church. And here's the reality. Developing brains, so the brains of anyone under 26 years old, do not thrive under endless choice. Endless access creates anxiety, not freedom. Limits communicate, I see reality, I'm paying attention, and your safety matters more than convenience. So if limits are a positive thing, boundaries then are not control for control's sake. They can be, right, the rules we set up in our household, they are control, but not just for control's sake. They are externalized wisdom until internal wisdom develops, right? And as parents, right, isn't that what we're trying to do? We're trying to cultivate, raise them up, and impart wisdom so that they can eventually, when they move out of the house, when they begin their own family, when they're raising their own kids, are wise themselves. And limits, the reason I think limits are so important is because they're actually a big part of reducing the risk, right, that technology exposes us to. Risk requires opportunity, and opportunity increases with privacy, late night access, emotional isolation, and lack of oversight. Limits, on the other hand, reduce opportunity, and reducing opportunity then lowers exposure dramatically. So we'll talk about, Hans already suggested a few. We've mentioned a few books that are going to have some of these that are really helpful. I picked out just 5. In terms of just some practical guardrails that I think start really young. And as kids are getting older, right, conversations can happen, compromise might be reached in some ways, but these are 5 that I think are really healthy, not just for our kids, but probably for us as adults too. First being phones sleep in the kitchen at night. I love this one because late night tired private scrolling is actually one of the highest windows for exposure and compulsive behavior. So if you remove that window, you lower the risk. I like this one, and I wish my wife and I were better at it, but devices stay out of the bedrooms. Like, go buy that analog alarm clock. Bedrooms are for rest and safety, not unmonitored exploration. So when the kids get home from school, they don't actually need to go sit on their bed for 30 minutes scrolling Instagram. Bedrooms are for rest, so the devices don't belong there. Shared access or accountability software, not because you expect evil, though we've talked about how the enemy is certainly using technology and advancement, but not purely just because you expect evil, but because you expect development and the challenges that come with it. So as we're helping our kids learn how to steward devices or steward accounts on various platforms, right, that accountability software and that shared access, make sure that nothing's happening to them either. Clear start and stop times, so endless access creates endless negotiation. But when we have predictable boundaries, we're going to reduce the power struggle. I'm not going to have to fight the phone out of your hand every time that I give it to you, or the tablet, or whatever it is. And last but not least, parents modeling the same rhythms. And I think this one matters really deeply. If you say, phone's down at 9 o'clock, but you yourself are scrolling till midnight, we're sending a very different message. The lesson absorbed is not the rule, it's the behavior. And so in this case, modeling is the formation we're looking for. And that's hard for us because sometimes we want that phone or we want that TV time after the kids are in bed. But the more that we model abiding by those rules and those, we are actually forming healthy rhythms and habits with our kids. But I want to talk about how we avoid extremes. So again, those are just kind of 5 practical ones that I picked out. There's plenty others out there. I would encourage you and your family to kind of talk about what makes sense. And maybe it gets to then evolve into a larger conversation amongst other families. And again, kind of back to that point we talked about during the Q&A. Like when the village is all kind of operating in the same direction, Like the kids are kind of getting it all reinforced from different angles. There's a real temptation, and an understandable one at that, of wanting to just pull smartphones entirely. Or maybe the other extreme is like, right, everyone has one, what's the big deal? Both reactions are understandable, but really neither is sufficient all by itself. What our kids need is to help think about how we steward the technology in front of us, whether that's our screen or our vehicles. It's really the same lesson. And stewardship looks like presence plus limits, conversation plus structure, and calm with clarity. Now, what I have not wanted to do this afternoon is induce unnecessary parent guilt or grandparent guilt or even student guilt. But, right, we've talked about a lot of these things. Maybe we use these apps. Maybe we don't abide by those practical rules. Wherever you're landing this afternoon, you might still be wondering, well, we already gave him a phone. I wish we would have waited. I should have known. But really, guilt isn't going to be a helpful guide here. Wisdom is, and using wisdom helps us remember that as people, even as adults, we can change rhythms. You still can implement guardrails, and you can increase conversations. As much as you might think that you're stuck right now, you aren't. But more importantly, that formation that we're actually wanting to instill to our children and to our in our families, it's going to happen over time. Ultimately, we're not just trying to win one battle, right? But we are trying to properly and with wisdom shape a more healthy trajectory. Okay, I won't spend too long on this, but this is kind of my last section I wanted to kind of talk about, because I imagine there's probably most of you in this room probably think I did something wrong, or I didn't do it right, I didn't have enough tools, and I didn't know. And I think there's actually still a lot of room for repair and hope. So if you're finding yourself sitting there this afternoon thinking, I didn't do it right, or I should have told them, or I should have had that conversation earlier, things will still probably go wrong moving forward. Exposures are going to happen. Mistakes will happen. Secrets may already exist. And I want us to be able to talk about that honestly. Otherwise, we start to feel the hopelessness that actually I think a lot of the media companies want us to feel. You're too late, just do it like everybody else. So if you find yourself in those moments, maybe you have a child who has looked up not just once, but maybe multiple times explicit content. Maybe you have found that hidden account again and again and again. Maybe you didn't know that they actually had 2 Instagram accounts. And on one account, they post something that you know about, and the other account, they post something entirely different. Or maybe your son is talking to somebody on Discord that you didn't know about. In that moment, your nervous system spikes. And again, you might be feeling all of that anger and that fear. But what matters most is how we respond to it. Your first response will shape whether that becomes a secret problem or a shared problem. And we don't want our teens today dealing with a bunch of secret problems. And so as the adults, despite how dysregulated we might be feeling when we find out that they pulled one over us, if that response ends up being explosive or catastrophic or shaming, children pick up the message that I won't bring this to you again, or I'll work really hard to make sure you don't catch me next time. But if our responses are steady, they will learn that this is serious, but I'm not alone in it. And that mom and dad aren't just trying to get me in trouble, but they're actually trying to help. I can't remember now which of my books, but it might have been that I kind of used as some inspiration for this afternoon's talk. But one of them highlighted that the first 24 hours is not where we try to solve the problem. Because in that moment, what's actually more at risk than them doing it again is whether they're ever going to bring it to you again. So, we could assume then that first 24 hours after the information is out, protecting that relationship it becomes the most important thing, because it might happen again, and we want to be there to show up again and again and again until it's not a problem. So in that first 24 hours, it's to protect the relationship. You can still implement boundaries, you can still adjust privileges, you can still discipline and add accountability. But if the relational safety is lost, recovery becomes much harder. And again, I want us to think about the long view, the formation over years, not just that moment. One of the dangers of conversations is that felt sense of urgency that leave you thinking, I have to fix everything immediately, because it is really scary. We don't really want our 8-year-old seeing that again, and we don't really want our 14-year-old talking to those people. But formation does not happen in a week. It doesn't happen in a couple hours, but it does happen over years. And that your child's relationship with technology, just like ours, will evolve. I wish I could predict what technology is going to look like in 10 years. 7 years ago, I worked for a technology company that was dabbling in AI and machine learning, and I had no idea that this is the moment we were going to be sitting in. Because in 2019, we weren't talking about ChatGPT, and we weren't talking about platforms that could create explicit images. But that is where we are today. And so again, the more that we can kind of help them think about how to steward these things and demonstrate some wisdom with them, we're actually helping them long term, not just in today's problems. That frees us, hopefully, from feeling like we have to fix everything immediately. Your child's relationship with technology will evolve, your strategy will evolve, their maturity will evolve. And your goal isn't necessarily to build a perfectly managed digital childhood, because that's probably what it's going to resemble more than we want it to. We are raising up and building human beings. And those human beings learn a lot better through repetition and repair and modeling and grace. The things that we can actually give them that the social media apps can't. The most resilient young adults I see in counseling, so people after 18, I do get to work with some college students and young adults, the most resilient ones of them are ones who tell me stories about the adults that stayed. When they told them the hard thing, they kept showing up. They are the ones who learned to ask for help. They were the ones who experienced correction without rejection. And they are also the ones who can practice recovery after failure. That is where we're actually seeing that formation show up. And it's a lot slower and stronger than panic. So I'll close with this. And this is kind of a final word to anyone still feeling some anxiety around technology. I realize I've said a lot and probably not enough all at once. None of us are going to get this perfectly, right? We need the same grace that we're hopefully going to show our kids. I imagine there will be plenty of times where you overreact in ways that you're not proud of. There will be moments where you underreact because you didn't know it was more serious than it sounded. You're going to miss things. And you're also still going to learn in real time. That's not failure. That is parenting. Your child doesn't need you to eliminate every digital risk, but they do need us to remain calm under pressure, to tell the truth about reality, to help us think about wisdom and setting wise limits. They need us to stay relational when things get uncomfortable, and they need to see us model repair when either of us mess up. Because again, that's not something they're getting on social media and through text messaging. That, I think, is the kind of steady and mature and protective calling that we have as parents. I think if I could sum up everything I've said in one sentence, it would be this. And I've totally abandoned my slides, so we're just going to go to the last one. Technology is powerful, but formation is far more powerful. And that formation happens really slowly in relationship over time, just as God designed it to. It's not from a spirit of fear or for getting it perfect. Rather, I think it comes from the steady and imperfect faithfulness. So that's where I'll leave us, and I guess I'll let the questions open back up.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Go ahead, Hans will come back up, and we'll have our two guys up here for our questions. Again, these are really great, stimulating, encouraging, challenging talks that we have heard today. So let's open it up for questions again. What would y'all want to ask right now?
What is your opinion of ChatGPT? I noticed you didn't list that as one of the apps that is risky. That and Alexa.
ChatGPT and Alexa, like what is my opinion on them? I don't know if this is where you were hoping I would take this answer. I think AI at its best, so tools like ChatGPT or Google Gemini or whichever one you're choosing, right? At its best, it's helping us be more productive, it's helping us learn, and it's helping us gain skills, maybe in areas that we don't yet know. At its worst, right, it's all the things that a lot of what media wants you to believe, which is it's taking over the world and it's taking everyone's jobs and it's doing all the bad stuff. Probably a lot like we talk about with smartphones. It's probably neither perfectly good nor perfectly bad. We'll say I occasionally will dabble on ChatGPT and love how it helps me write things like Excel spreadsheet formulas because I know next to nothing about Excel. At its worst, kids are using AI as best friends, and that's probably not helpful because a program is not going to be the same as a warm relationship where someone can smile and actually engage with hard things. So I guess I won't say I'm totally apathetic or ambivalent towards things like Alexa or ChatGPT or Google Gemini, but I think, like with so much, our kids today need our help figuring out how to use them in helpful ways and using them well without relocating, I think, what God has designed us to do and think about how to problem solve and do things.
I have a friend that is probably in her early 60s, maybe late 50s, and she told me the other day, I have a new friend in my house. And I said, oh, you do? And she said, yeah, her name's Alexa. And she sits and talks to Alexa like a friend. And I thought, that's really dangerous to take something like that and exchange it for a relationship or a friendship with a friend. It's scary.
Yeah.
So I teach college students, and so on the ChatGPT, and it's only been a few years now, but that's something we're still wrestling to think about well, and what the implications are for what we're doing, particularly in a liberal arts context. And I would say that I use ChatGPT. I got an account. I wanted to use it just to know what's going on and to understand what it can do, what it can't do. And so if you haven't used something like it's a large language learning model. If you haven't used something like that, it's very powerful, and you don't have to have programming skills, for instance, and you can just ask it to just create something for you, and it does it in seconds, minutes, and so it's quite remarkable. But the issue that it raises for me is, so as a professor, I get when students come, high school students graduate, they're coming in as freshmen, they're 19, 20 years old, and so particularly in the humanities, I'm trying to help students to think critically, to be able to read books and engage with sources and be able to, sort of process information and be able to summarize or write an essay, develop a thesis, and defend that thesis. Basically, to mature as a Christian, as a human being, and be able to depending on whatever vocation or calling you end up in, and ChatGPT and the AI like that completely short circuit all of that. So so if I give them an essay, here's an essay that I want you to write, and here's the prompt. I mean, the student could just go and just put the prompt in and get an essay, and actually you could tell the ChatGPT, do this as if I'm a 20-year-old college student, I'm sort of mediocre at English, and you know what I mean, and include these kinds of sources and write in this particular style. And in less than 3 minutes, they've got a full essay, And so you can see how that, for me, for those of people that teach English, right? I mean, I teach theology, but philosophy, it's like an existential threat, Like, what are we doing here? Why am I lecturing? Why am I giving you assignments if you can, So those are the kinds of issues that it raises. So I do think it's very powerful, and there's all kinds of, and I use it personally. There's all kinds of ways. It's sort of like you could use it like a Wikipedia or just Google amped up, but there's all kinds of other things it can do. But I think for a child, like a teenager or a high school student who's sort of still growing, and it's one thing for a 50-year-old or 60-year-old to use it, and you've gone through you've gone through school, you've sort of learned how to think critically, and now here's this tool. But for a teenager who hasn't learned any of that, and then there's this AI that prevents you from going through that process, it really short circuits education, learning, maturity. I mean, all of that, growing in wisdom, and just imagine what it does for us as a society, and we're sort of seeing that. So it's for those of you who are homeschooling, or if you have kids who are in high school, my view is the longer they can, they should just avoid those kinds of programs and learn how to read books and learn how to think critically. All of those things. Down the road, it's not like it's really complicated. They will learn how to, it's easy to figure out, and AI in 5 years is going to be different from what it is now, but they just gotta, they can't short circuit the process that forms them as adults and thinkers and critical thinkers who can follow Christ in the world and in culture. And there's all of this stuff coming at us. We've got to learn how to think wisely and how to think critically. And I'm really worried that AI and some of these technologies are curtailing that and in our young people. Sorry, I have a lot of thoughts on on ChatGPT.
Who else has a question? We got one here, and was that a hand too? No? Okay.
I was going to wait and ask this toward the end, but I don't know when the end is going to be. So if I understand from Jonathan Haidt's research, if I read him correctly, he identified two factors especially that led to the anxious generation. One, of course, was the social media and digital technology. The other one was the lack of unstructured play.
Hmm.
And so I'm wondering, have you seen that in your counseling practice, that those twin symptoms or perhaps, have you seen that as a diagnosis in some of the clients you've had?
am I seeing like an increased anxiousness in people who probably were?
You see those twin problems, both the social media, digital technologies, and the lack of unstructured play in the formation of those that you are counseling?
Yeah, and I think it's a great question. Daniel kindly provided us a cheat sheet of some of the questions, and I actually think it kind of relates to one of these questions. The reason that apps like Alexa are problematic is because it can't replace a real human interaction. Social media isn't actually replacing human interaction, right? Because it comes with all the baggage of the downsides. I think what Haidt was attempting to kind of highlight is there is no replacement for what develops a kid in a healthy way apart from in relationship with each other, with adults, where they're learning independence, where they're learning to critically think. And I'd say, yeah, like, I don't think it's all the social media. I think there is like a really important piece of like, okay, but so what do you give them? Because if they don't have that either, like they're going to struggle. And so what was lost for much of the generation that, tablets were starting to be handed to them younger and younger and younger, or phones were given to them, is that they lost the play outside, they lost the social skills, they lost how to work to find compromise and to kind of deal with the social repercussions of bullying somebody or whatever it was, right? Like the valuable things that happen just in peer contact, that at its, at technology's best, it's giving you a taste of it. I don't know how many of you guys might have like friends who live in other states, right, where you try to do a FaceTime call, and it's like, well, it's sweet to get to see them and laugh with them. It pales in comparison to them sitting across the dinner table. And I think kids, if we are experiencing that as adults, where we're feeling the kind of the incongruent, disconnected reality of social media not filling that gap, technology can't fill it for our kids even worse.
I've got none there. That's good.
Along with the Alexis, Siri kind of thing, Big Brother would say, yeah, just make sure you have a good microphone and a camera so that it'll be most effective. We forget, as Christians, where we go, we have a microphone and there's a camera showing God what we say, what we do. And how are we affected when we remember that versus the freedom sitting around in our house and have those same things that are there to people you don't know, don't trust, don't have the truth.
Thanks for the comment. I think that's helpful. I don't really have much to add. I don't have much to add. But
Yeah, but it definitely goes kind of in line with that, kind of what I was trying to get at with the kind of that realm of secrecy. It's especially confusing for kids, but that's often just the breeding ground. And as adults, if it starts there, it doesn't just go away because we get older, right?
You talked about like the technology situation, like realizing like this is not normal, like that's not how people lived. But if it's not normal, do you think people have realized that as a nation? And do you think they'll ever like fight against like, oh, this is not normal, we need to change? Or if they do realize that this isn't normal, why are we continuing to go in this direction and realize like, oh, it's fine, even though like reality it's not? Like, why are they just like, it's fine, we don't really care?
Before we started today, Hans and I were talking briefly, and Facebook launched, what, 2007, 2006, around then. That was 20 years ago. And Meta is only, Facebook is only just now kind of in some hot water. I think it takes us a long time societally to probably look up and go, wait a second, what happened? This isn't normal. And we have those responses, right? And in some ways, I think there's there's probably an inherent passivity in us that we just kind of adapt and we let things happen. We're not always aware of whether it's a healthy change or an unhealthy change. Thankfully, sometimes we do have the ability to look up and we go, this isn't right, or this isn't what it's supposed to be. I miss the old days. Interestingly, I think that sentiment is starting to be shared by people younger and younger. So right now, we have kids who are like, I miss hanging out with my friends before we all just sat on TikTok together. And what we don't know is, like we were talking about, like, what is AI going to look like in 10 or 15 years? At what point, at least here in the United States, at what point might we look up and go, wait a second, it just did something really damaging. Can we even peel it back? It's kind of sad that we tend to wait a long time before we look up and go, wait a second, that wasn't right, or that wasn't helpful. But I think that what can be helpful is to talk about it right now. Right? And that's what I guess I'm hoping that everyone takes away from this, is it's not just the problem to be scared of, but hopefully invite a lot more conversations around, well, what is good about it and what's bad about it? And let's be honest. I hope that at least gets to part of your question. I'm not sure I got it all the way.
And I think, we're talking about it, and Joey's referenced a lot in different states, schools are recognizing this and trying to be proactive. But it is interesting. I mean, the data is there. I mean, we know we have a good idea of what these technologies are doing and some of their harmful effects. But like I mentioned in my talk, Australia has actually taken legislative action, and some other countries are moving in that direction. But in Twenge's 10 Rules book, she actually, in her intro, she basically says that in the US, what needs to happen is that this issue is so serious, and this relates to our families and this relates to our children, that there needs to be federal level legislation. There needs to be guidance at a federal level that to address these issues, but it's not going to happen. And it's not going to happen because of largely monetary, financial reasons. And so she basically said, it's up to us. It's up to us, our families, and that's why she wrote the book. She says, we can't wait. The government doesn't seem to want to act and do anything. So she's like, I've written this book to help families and communities and churches, et cetera. But I think the evidence is there, but there are these larger forces that unfortunately, at least in this country, are preventing us perhaps from doing what needs to be done at a structural, systemic level.
Other questions? We still have a few minutes. So I'm going to look down this sheet that we had. These are some of the ones that were presented. A lot of these have been covered. Y'all have covered a lot of these. I'll just look at the first one there, kind of like the mix of using and avoiding. I think one of you were talking about kind of that entry level in. You don't want to just send your 18-year-old away to college with no experience in social media. The question is, how do you help teenagers begin to use social media in a culture that overuses social media?
I think your talk was great. They sort of addressed that really well.
It's such even my knee-jerk reaction as somebody who's on a lot of social media platforms, and I'm ashamed of my screen time use every week. I I wish we could just say, like, just get off all of it. It's not that that's impossible, but right, we immediately jump to how impractical that feels. My hope is that, and I actually feel like this is proving to be true, I think teenagers are discovering it too. Thankfully, at least at this point, I don't know if we could have said this even 2 years ago, I think today's teens are more aware of the kind of destructive nature of social media than ever. There's a lot of kids who are deciding, like, I don't want to use that app, or I'm tired of looking at Instagram and TikTok, and I'm tired of people passively selling me stuff, and I'm tired of getting compared to unrealistic beauty standards, or whatever their sentiment is. I think one of the things that we could do that probably doesn't get done enough is to just have more dialogue about it. Like, what is the good that we're getting from it? You know, maybe Facebook or an Instagram is genuinely a way that we're keeping up with a few people. And if that's why we're logging in to periodically check it throughout the week, maybe there's some good in that. So I think, I don't know, I guess for me, part of this question is even just getting at, well, what are we trying to get out of social media? Because I think the media companies themselves want you to get a lot more out of it than you probably signed up for. And if we're thoughtful about, okay, so what do I want out of it, well, we're taking some of that autonomy back and going, okay, so I'm going to use it for what I want it for. And when it's no longer serving that purpose, I'm going to feel a lot happier to put it away. But if I just show up assuming that it's going to give me, it's going to give me a lot. But if I haven't really thought about it, it's probably going to give me more than I needed.
One of my colleagues teaches a Christian spirituality class, and I think they have there's a component of the course where the class goes to I'm not sure if it's a monastery, but some kind of retreat, but they're not allowed to have any cell phones. And so it ends up being this experience of the student maybe a week or so without any media access. And it's interesting how a number of the students will say initially that it's terrifying. Like, what am I going to do? And some students are like, maybe I should drop this class because I don't think I can handle it. And then on the far side of the experience, just describing how that fast or sabbatical or whatever you want to call it, just how meaningful and significant it was. And so I think if it's a teenager, if there's some way to allow them to experience something, if the teenager already has a phone or media access, and just as part of the conversation, let's have a fast for this period of time, and let them just experience what that's like, not having to worry, not having constant access, and they might actually come away with a very positive appreciation, and that can be sort of part of a journey that they're on in terms of their relationship with the technology.
Well, we got another question.
Yeah, sorry, maybe I missed it too. But okay, so as a person who doesn't have children, so I'm not like raising someone to be technologically adept, but I have a lot of people within including my nieces who are not of the age to be able to have social media accounts, but they both do, and it's troubling to me, but it's also kind of like, it's not my kids, what can I do about it? Like, how can we be influential of the people around us to be responsible consumers of technology? It's kind of like, how do you tell somebody to stop being racist? So it's like, what do we do to be the influences to people, I guess, specifically when it comes to that?
Yeah, it's hard. Assuming you're talking about family and extended family, I think I'm thinking of someone in my extended family, and it's sort of sad. In this case, there's a daughter who I think has ended up through social media having this alternate community that she's been in, and it's sort of the trans community and so on, and she's struggled with anxiety and depression. So all the things we've been talking about, and in that case, it's hard. I mean, I think two things I'll say, and hopefully you're gonna solve this one. But I think if it's early on, like if it's early on that someone in your extended family and you see sort of red flags, I think at that point it might be some conversation might be appropriate and natural, and then, but the problem is more when it's sort of the horse is out of the barn, and all of the negative things that we've discussed or have been underway. Yeah, I think prayer, lots of praying and commending in the individual, the family, to the Lord. It's difficult. I just find it easier at the front end if you're able to speak into that. But once things are in process, it's just messy and it's hard, and whatever you can do that's going to be received well, right? But it's often just gnarly and complicated.
Yeah, I mean, I would very much affirm what Hans is saying. I think about, obviously, like the earlier we could talk about it, the better, right? With so many things. And maybe this is the counselor training in me coming up. I would try to ask more questions than tell people things, right? Like, so much of our world, including what happens on social media, is about what we say, not what we're being curious about. I think we've talked about height so much, but I think I do stand by, I think what he helped kind of uncover was incredibly valuable for people across the aisle. I think for a lot of people, they just don't know. Like probably the significance of his book is not even just what he wrote, but it's the fact that he finally put it into words, and a bunch of people opened their eyes when they read them and went, oh my goodness, I had no idea. So I would be curious, do the parents know about accounts? Are they aware of what kind of stuff is getting posted, right? Like, I think I would be curious about some of those questions maybe before leading with advice. People tend to, I don't know, maybe that's my counseling training, but people tend to engage with our opinions once they think that we're actually interested in them. And that's probably just a little bit of our cultural PTSD of everyone screaming from their own platform. So my exhortation to you would be lead with some questions. What you might find is that they just don't know, or that they don't know that what they do know is problematic. In which case, thankfully, there are a lot more resources today than there were even a few years ago.
As a follow-up to that, do you have any suggested questions to ask? Kind of like Greg Kokel in his apologetic asked the question, what do you mean by that? Do you have any examples that you could give? I guess that's an open-ended question, but. Questions that wouldn't slam the door, but would get them to think and converse.
One that I could imagine being less divisive might even just be like, what do conversations with your teen look like? It's funny, you used the word open-ended question. I would advise leading with some open-ended questions, right? Ones that they can't say yes and no as the answer. And questions that start with the word why tend to solicit a defensive response. So I think I would be, to the best of your ability, try to engage with some curiosity, the who, whats, wheres before we get to why. But I wonder if like a softer entry point might just be to be curious about what kind of conversations they are having with their kids. For all you know, you might be catching a parent or a friend or a sibling who's just like, I'm drowning. I talk to my kids about social media 7 days a week. This is the 6th account they've had. Like, you don't know where they're already at. Maybe they know more than you think they do. Maybe they're bothered by it more than you think they are. Maybe they feel like they just have no support, and you might be catching them at a place where they're already throwing their hands up in the air. And so you might more quickly realize you're coming alongside them as the first support character than they had before. So I think that's one I would start with.
Yeah, I'm just thinking of all the examples that I can think of. Often when it's everyone around them, everyone can see, oh, this is not going to end well, or maybe the parent is being unwise, and this kid's barely a teenager and has a smartphone. They're in church. They're always looking at the phone, and it's those kinds of situations. It's not for lack of knowledge, but it's usually something like you've got, maybe the parent, the dad's an elder, or and for whatever reason, it's just it feels really complicated to sort of raise this issue, and so it's sad, but you just sort of see it. Everyone sort of sees it playing out, and maybe in that case, I think it does help if someone maybe just sort of has the courage to kind of take the dad to the side and just say, do you see what is happening to your son? Like, we can all see it, don't you see this? And so there's some situations where, take a softer, gentler approach. But I can also think of scenarios where everyone can see what's happening and no one wants to say anything for what X, Y, Z reasons. And that's why when you ask the question, that's just like, it's always really complicated. I remember, like, when I was younger, I thought, whenever a situation like this arises, or when I was younger and I would see these kinds of situations, I'm like, man, if I was one of these players, I would just go in there and tell them what needs to be said, and why is everyone tiptoeing? And now I'm like, okay, I understand, So yeah, sometimes, and if there is that one person, depending on the situation, if there's one person willing to just have that conversation, that might make all the difference. But yeah, they're just different situations and different circumstances. So I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all kind of approach.
All right, do we have maybe one final question? Going once, going twice. All right. Oh, I saw that hand, even though it went down really quick. I want to thank you guys for being with us today, for challenging us. Yes. It has been a pleasure. I'm going to pray for us. I will say this, the sessions have been recorded, so if you are interested in just listening again, hearing all of this, you can talk with the other Daniel, Daniel Johnson, because he'll have access to all of that probably sometime next week. But let me go ahead and pray for us, and then y'all can continue your conversations and questions. Father, I do thank you for today. I thank you for these sessions, how they are inviting conversations into families and homes and churches, challenging our hearts to think about how we steward the things that are around us. And so I just pray that you would be with us as we consider how to wisely use technology and all the things that it throws at us, and just the unknown future that will be thrown at us over the next years and decades. Give us wisdom to come at things from a Christian worldview and in a way that would honor you and build up your kingdom. We thank you again for our time, and it's in Jesus' name I pray. Amen.